This is Keerthana presenting on the topic different approaches to dialectology, traditional and structural approach. Before we understand what traditional and structural approaches are, it is important for us to understand what does the term approach to dialectology or approach to a language means. This term can be used to refer to a variety of perspectives or frameworks for understanding and studying language. These approaches differ in their underlying assumptions about the different aspects of language, which include its nature, its relationship to thoughts, and how it is acquired and used. Some of the questions that different approaches to a language seek to answer are: what is the nature of language? How is language related to thought? How do we acquire and use language? How does language vary across societies and cultures? How do we use language to communicate meaning? The answers to these questions vary depending on the specific approach being taken. However, all approaches to language share the goal of understanding the complex and fascinating phenomenon of human language. Traditional and structural approaches are one of the approach methods. These are two methods in the field of dialectology, which is the study of regional variation in language. Traditional approach. This approach to dialectology focuses on the collection and description of dialects. It often involves fieldwork where linguists travel to various regions to interview native speakers and collect data on the dialect features they use. The emphasis is on documenting and preserving dialects as they exist in their natural environment. Traditional dialectologists may produce detailed phonetic transcriptions, word lists, and maps to represent dialectal variation. This approach dominated the field for much of the 19th and 20th century, and it focused on mapping and classifying dialect based on their geographical distribution. Identify and map dialect boundaries. Researchers would collect data from speakers across a region, typically through surveys or interviews, and then analyze the data to identify linguistic features that varied geographically. These features can include pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. By plotting the distribution of these features on map, they aim to draw lines which are isoglosses around areas where the same features were spoken, creating dialect boundaries. Classify dialects into groups. Based on the shared features and isoglosses, dialects were then classified into larger groups of families. This classification was often hierarchical, which means that some of the dialects were considered more prestigious or standard than others. Trace the historical development of dialects. By studying the geographical distribution and historical development of linguistic features, researchers aim to reconstruct the linguistic history of a region and understand how dialects diverge from a common ancestor. Some key characteristics of traditional approach. Focus on geography. Dialects were primarily seen as geographically bound entities with boundaries separating them. Static view of language. Dialects were often treated as fixed and unchanging entities, ignoring internal variation and speaker agency. Emphasis on structural features. The analysis mainly focused on pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, with less attention to social factors or discourse. Descriptive, not explanatory. While the approach effectively mapped and classified dialects, it often lacked explanation for why dialects arose and how they functioned. Example of a research method commonly used in traditional approach: dialect surveys. Dialect surveys are a type of field research in which linguists collect data on of the speech of speakers from different geographical regions and social groups. The data can be collected through a variety of methods such as interviews, word lists, or narrative recordings. The data collected from dialect survey is then analyzed to identify and describe dialective features, map their geographical distribution, and identify dialect boundaries. One example of dialect survey is the Linguistic Atlas of the United States, LA, US. It is a dialect survey that was conducted in the 1930s and 1940s. The LAUS collected data from over 800 speakers from all over the United States. The data was then analyzed to produce a series of maps that show the geographical distribution of different dialect features. The LAUS is one of the most important resources for the study of American English dialects. Advantages and disadvantages of traditional approach in dialectology. Advantages. The traditional approach has a long history and is well established. It has a strong focus on geographical variation in language, which is useful for understanding the spread of language change and the relationship between language and culture. It has produced a wealth of data on dialect features, which can be used to document and preserve endangered dialects. Disadvantages. The traditional approach can be time consuming and labor intensive, especially when conducting dialect surveys. It has been criticized for its focus on rural and its neglect of social factors. It can be difficult to distinguish between dialect variation and other type of variation, such as individual variation and variation due to different communicative contexts. While the traditional approach laid the foundation for dialectology, it has been significantly challenged and refined in recent decades. Modern dialectologists now embrace a more nuanced understanding of dialects, incorporating social variance, speaker agency, and dynamic language change into their analysis. Structural approach. The structural approach, also known as the synchronic or modern dialectology, emphasizes on the analysis of linguistic structure within dialects. It is less concerned with historical aspects of the dialect and more focused on describing their grammatical and phonological features as they exist at a specific point of time. Structural dialectologists may use methods like linguistic survey, social linguistic interviews, and statistical analysis to identify and analyze patterns of variation. This approach often seeks to uncover linguistic rules and patterns that govern dialectal variation. The structural approach in a dialectology emerged in the mid 20th century as a response to perceived limitations of the traditional method. It aimed to overcome the focus on geographical boundaries and static descriptions by analyzing dialects within a broader linguistic framework. Analyze dialects with a structural framework. Instead of simply listing and mapping individual features, they aim to understand how these features functioned within the overall system of the dialect. This involved analyzing phonological patterns, morphological rules, and syntactical structures, drawing on concepts from structural linguists. Focus on underlying systems, not just surface variation. Rather than simply comparing individual pronunciations or words, they analyze the underlying sound systems and grammatical rules that generated them. This allowed for a more systematic understanding of dialect differences. Explain dialect variation through sound changes and internal pressures. Instead of interviewing dialects as static entities, defined by boundaries. They explored how sound changes and other internal pressures within a language system could lead to dialect differentiation. This provided a more dynamic perspective on language change. Integrate social factors with linguistic variation. While acknowledging the importance of geography, structural dialectologists also recognize the role of social factors like age, gender, and social class in shaping dialect variation. They examine how these factors influence the use of specific linguistic features within a dialect. Move beyond description towards explanation. The goal wasn't just to map and classify, but to explain why dialects arise, how they function, and how they interact with each other. This involved exploring concepts like isoglosses, bundles, and dialect continua. Key characteristics of structural approach: emphasis on internal structure. Dialects can Dialects are seen as systems in their own internal rules and patterns, not just collection of isolated features. Dynamic view of language. Dialects are constantly evolving due to sound changes, social pressures, and contact with other languages. Integration of social factors. Social variation is recognized as an important factor shaping dialect use and change. Explanatory focus. The approach seeks to understand the causes and consequences of dialect variation. The kind of information sought. A linguist following the structural approach might conduct a sociolinguistic interview to study dialect variation in a number of different scenarios. The sociolinguistic interview, a linguist using the structural approach would typically seek to gather information about the following: the speaker's social background, age, gender, social class, education, etc. The speaker's language use in different social contexts, at home, at work, with friends, with strangers. The speaker's attitude towards different language varieties. The linguist might also ask the speaker to produce specific linguistic forms such as words, phrases, or sentences. This is done to a variety of linguistic data that can be used to identify and describe dialect features. For example, a linguist might be interested in studying how the pronunciation of the word tomato varies across different social groups. To do this, the linguist may conduct social linguistic interviews with speakers from different age groups, social classes, and geographical regions. During the interview, the linguist would ask the speakers to pronounce the word tomato in a variety of contexts. The linguist would then analyze the data and identify any pattern in the pronunciation of the word. Advantages and disadvantages of structural approach in dialectology. Advantages: the structural approach has a strong focus on systematic variation in language, which is useful for understanding how language works as a system. It takes into account the relationship between language variation and social factors, which is important for understanding how language is used to express social identity and to perform different social roles. It can be used to develop theoretical models of language variation and change. Disadvantages: the structural approach can be complex and difficult to understand. It can be difficult to apply the structural approach to large data sets. There is less consensus among structural dialectologists about how to best study language variation. Differences. Key differences in research objectives. Traditional approach identifies and describes regional variation in language, whereas structural approach understands how different parts of a dialect systems are interrelated. Traditional approach understands the geographical distribution of dialect features, whereas structural approach understands how dialect systems vary across different social groups and contexts. Traditional approach maps the boundaries between different dialect areas, whereas structural approach investigates the relationship between language variation and social factors. Traditional approach documents and preserves endangered dialects, whereas structural approach develops theoretical models of language variation change. A traditional dialectologist might conduct a dialect survey to identify and describe the different dialects of English spoken in United States. The dialectologist might then use this data to create a map showing the geographical distribution of different dialect features, such as the pronunciation of the word tomato. A structural dialectologist, on the other hand, might conduct a dialect survey to investigate the relationship between language variation and social factors such as age, gender, and social class. The dialectologist might find, for example, the younger speakers are more likely to use certain dialect features than the older speakers. Situations where each approach may be more appropriate for research. The traditional approach is more appropriate for research that aims to identify and describe the different dialects of a language, understand the geographical distribution of dialect features, map the boundaries between different dialect areas, document and preserve endangered dialects. The structural approach is more appropriate for research that aims to understand how the different parts of a dialect systems are interrelated, understand how dialect systems vary across different social groups, and investigate the relationship between language variation and social factors, develop theoretical models of language variation and change. In some cases, it may be beneficial to use a combination of traditional and structural methods in research on dialectal variation. For example, a researcher may use traditional methods to collect data on dialect features and then use structural method to analyze the data and identify patterns of variation. Ultimately, the best approach to research on dialectal variation depends on the specific research questions the researcher is trying to answer. In summary, the traditional approach is more concerned with the preservation and documentation of dialects, while the structural approach focuses on analysis of the linguistic structures within dialects, often in contemporary contexts. Both approaches are valuable in understanding regional language variation. Thank you.